Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Rachel Edwards, and I am a student studying sociology and African American studies at Boston University. I'd like to thank you all for coming out to this event. I'd also like to thank the African American Studies program for sponsoring this event, as well as the College of Arts and Sciences Conversations on Race program.
And my name is Donavon Young. I'm a junior here at BU as well, studying economics and minoring in African American Studies as well. And I would also like to thank Dr. Louis chude-sokei for advising us on this program tonight.
I'm going to go ahead and start by introducing some of our lovely panelists. I will start by introducing Professor Saida Grundy. She's an assistant professor of sociology and African American studies at Boston University. Her research to date has focused upon formations and ideologies of gender within the black middle class, specifically men. Her current work examines graduates of Morehouse College, the nation's only historically black college for men, and how the men of Morehouse experience gender and manhood at an institution that attempts to groom them as solutions to young black men in crisis. Thank you, Professor Gundy, for your participation. Um, um, Go ahead.
All right. And so I want to introduce our next panelist, Takeo Rivera. So at Boston University, Takeo Rivera is a specialist in modern and contemporary drama with a focus on race, sexuality, and gender in U.S. American cultural production. His current project, Racial Masochism, explores the relationship between power and pleasure within the traumas of racialization, examining effective attachments to non-human, machine-like stereotypical forms. So I just want to give a round of applause for Takeo Rivera for being here tonight.
Next is our special guest, Dr. Adrienne Keene. She is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and an assistant professor in American Studies and Ethnic Studies at Brown University. Her research examines Indigenous students navigating the college process and the role of pre-college access programs in student success. She also is the creator and author of Native Appropriations, a blog examining representations of Native peoples in popular culture and the ongoing effects of cultural appropriation.
And last but not least, I want to introduce Joseph Resnick. As a teacher in English and American Studies, Joseph Resnick specializes in theories of modernity in the Atlantic world, especially Black Atlantic literature and the history of print in American culture. In his scholarship, he tells how stories about the relationship between the technology of print and the literature, history, and culture of the post-revolutionary Anglophone world. So give a round of applause for Joseph Resnick.
Okay, so now that we've introduced our panelists, we'd love to get started. The first question is directed to Dr. Keene. Noting your work on Native appropriations, we'd just love for you to give us an overview of that and some of the terminology you use when discussing cultural appropriation.
Sionagata. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to admit that I knew this question was coming. So, I actually wanted to. So, I've been writing Native appropriations for 8 years now, which in internet years is like a century. That's a really, really long time. And I started it when I was a first year grad student here in Boston at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And the work came out of my own feelings of isolation and invisibility as a graduate student, as a Native graduate student. And it, in 2010, was kind of the start of this resurgence of the tribal trends in fashion that we sort of see everywhere. So that was kind of the impetus to start the blog, to really start cataloging and thinking about some of these images that we were seeing in fashion and popular culture. So now, over the past 8 years, I've seen the conversation on cultural appropriation go from being something that was very much in kind of academic circles and anthropology and some of the worlds that I occupied prior to graduate school. Then now it's everywhere, and we see it in the Washington Post and the New York Times and blogs and Twitter and everywhere. So I've pulled together a series of quotations, a bunch of different quotes and definitions of cultural appropriation and then a couple of them that problematize the way that we think about it. And so I wanted to offer them as kind of framing for the panel, so we can use them to jump off of and talk about and move forward from there. So the most basic definition that I use in most of my presentations comes from a First Nations writer who is Indigenous in Canada, named Lenore Keeshing Tobias. And the thing I like to point out about this quote is she said it in 1990. So people often think that this is like a new conversation, but she was writing essays about the stealing of Native voices in storytelling in the 90s. So she just says that cultural appropriation is taking from a culture that is not one's own, intellectual property, cultural expressions and artifacts, history, and ways of knowledge. So that's the most basic level, but it's actually missing a few pieces. So then there's a group at Simon Fraser University called Intellectual Property Issues and Cultural Heritage Project, IPINCH. And they say cultural appropriation describes a one-sided process where an entity benefits from another group's culture without permission and without giving something in return. So that starts to get at these kind of issues of power and imbalance that I think are inherent to the conversation. And then, as an academic, I'm embarrassed that I'm quoting this, but Wikipedia has a fairly decent definition. And the piece that I think is important is that cultural appropriation is distinguished from equal cultural exchange due to the presence of a colonial element and an imbalance of power. So the imbalance of power is the most important part to me. And then this quotation I love, and it's a little bit longer, but it comes from an article called Turbans on the Runway. What does it mean for Sikhs? By a writer named Sunny Singh. And they say the thing about cultural appropriation is that the appropriator does not have to face the same consequences that we do for practicing our culture or faith. For them, it is an accessory that can be taken on or off at will, while for us, it is a way of life. I'm not saying cultural or religious garb or practices should not be shared. Culture never exists in a vacuum and is never pure, nor should it be. It is ever changing, evolving, and growing. But in a society where immigrants and communities of color are marginalized at every level, we can't pretend that power relations do not exist when we have this conversation about appropriation. Sharing and exchanging cultural and spiritual practices is great, but it gets more complicated when we're not all on equal footing. It gets more complicated when meaningful things are taken, commodified, and exploited for a profit with little respect shown to the community they were taken from. And then the last thing I wanted to bring up is a scholar named Minha Pham, who is incredible. She actually puts forward this term of racial plagiarism rather than cultural appropriation. Because she says in popular discourse, cultural appropriation / cultural appreciation encompasses a wide and largely incoherent range of cultural practices. In addition to the unauthorized copying of ethnic and indigenous creative and cultural works, cultural appropriation / cultural appreciation is routinely applied to to instances of racist language, like the Washington football team, racist representations and performances, like Katy Perry's geisha routine at the 2013 American Music Awards, cross-cultural eating, like a non-Japanese person eating Japanese food, and acts of cultural assimilation, like non-Western immigrants wearing jeans and sneakers. And she continues and says that gathering all of these activities under appropriation appreciation umbrella both conflates and obscures the specific power dynamics inherent to these cultural phenomena. Its emphasis on individual feelings, intentions, and uses rather than structurally contextualized practices encourages false equivalences. And so she puts forward racial plagiarism and says racial plagiarism centrally involves and colludes in racial capitalist processes of value extraction in which racialized groups' resources of knowledge, labor, and cultural heritage are exploited for the benefit of dominant groups in ways that maintain dominant socioeconomic relationships. Extraction and exploitation, not exchange, are at the core of this type of copying. They are not just effects of racial plagiarism, but its constitutive elements. So that's Minha Pham, who is incredible. And so I'll end there with those various things to get us thinking. Widow.
Thank you, Professor Keene. Before I ask the panelists to respond to some of those definitions and the language that we're using, I'd like to invite Dr. Chude-sokei to the stage, please. Um, if you're, yeah, you can come up to the side. I'm going to quickly read his bio so that you guys have an introduction to him. Louis Chude-sokei is the director of Boston University's African American Studies program, and he's a writer and scholar whose work ranges widely in and around the literary, political, and cultural phenomenon of the African diaspora. Chude-sokei is also the editor-in-chief of The Black Scholar, one of the oldest journals of Black studies, which was this year ranked Princeton Journal's Review as the #1 journal of Black studies in the United States. Awesome. So, yes, go ahead.
So, based off of a lot of those definitions that Professor King gave us, I just wanted to ask you guys to the panel, why do you think cultural appropriation has become such a very hot topic as of now or over these past couple of years?
There's a wider public that is familiar with terms. I mean, thank you. There are terms that I think hit the sort of cultural frying pan, right? It does not mean that the terms are new, and it certainly doesn't mean that the practices are new. I'm very encouraged to hear, popular discourse talk about intersectionality. Or, there was a time where you would never have heard a term like white supremacy be used in mainstream media, and now that's pretty fit for print, right? So, gotta be. So I think the term, I think in academic research, oftentimes we take this arc of like, oh, in 15 years, people will be talking about this term I coined, and which is kind of what's happened. I don't think it's at all new, and in fact, there's no way to divorce cultural appropriation from colonialism. And of course, colonialism is 3-4 centuries old. The original appropriation was of people's bodies, right? It was taking Sarji Bartman out of what present day South Africa and extracting her actual body to be on a display, a freak show to hypersexualize a black woman's body. I mean, those were the original forms of appropriation, the actual extraction of human beings to serve a white gaze, right? Circuses. You all know the history of circuses. Besides being extremely torturous places for animals, they replaced their animals just replaced the human beings that they used to torture in those spaces. So circuses used to be about a racist white exploitation of indigenous peoples across the globe, right? This was not only common practice; it was just a form of white entertainment. That was the forms we in which we understood cultural appropriation to have originated. So, the term, thanks to scholars like you've so wonderfully informed us about today, exists in the popular lexicon, but those terms have a history, and then I think that like many things, when you have a framework for an idea, you can therefore discuss the idea. And I think that's what's happened with this.
Before I respond, I just want to wanted to thank Rachel and Donovan, who are like amazing student leaders. Thanks so much for moderating this, and thank you for organizing this. And thanks again to Professor chude-sokei as well for really doing wonderful leadership for AFAM. But anyway, the question of after Professor Keene sort of gave that list of definitions, I'm like, oh, are we done? We can go now. I think that pretty much does the job. But in terms of why it's blowing up or why it's particularly prevalent right now, I guess there's a part of me that feels, in reference to what Professor Keene has just said, there's a part of me that actually has a slightly more cynical take on things as well, because I do think in some ways, I think in a lot of ways, the privatization and the commodification of culture at large has resulted in the proliferation of misunderstandings of cultural appropriation as well, right? I think one of the problem, I really appreciate the final quote by Minha Pham on the racial plagiarism, because I think let me just give you an anecdote. Way back in grad school, we put on this documentary viewing of about this woman named Grace Lee Boggs, she's a Chinese American Black Power theorist, right? But of Chinese American descent. And in the documentary, Angela Davis says about Grace Lee Boggs, like Angela Davis said she's done more for black people than many black people. Right? So we're having this talk back, and I'm facilitating one of the small groups, and there's this Black Lives Matter activist in my group. The first thing she says is, "Well, I'm really uncomfortable with the fact that Grace Lee Boggs is appropriating blackness," and I'm like, I'm not sure if we're really on the same page of what that means. And so my concern is whether or not appropriation discourse, which was originally developed, right, for us to think about these forms of racial plagiarism, forms of colonialism, forms of truly exploitation, right? Right. When I think about cultural appropriation, I'm thinking, like the first example that comes to mind is like Philip Deloria's elaboration of like, I don't know if folks have read like Playing Indian, for example, right? Of like the ways in which white settler colonialism in the United States, for example, has like stolen from the imagery of First Nations people in order to like give themselves a sense of legibility, right? But then if we're thinking about the non-black people utilizing black thought to reach revolutionary conclusions, then I think we have a bit of a problem in terms of our definitions about what cultural appropriation is. And I think that cultural appropriation discourse has to be always thought of in terms of that, in terms of cultural exploitation, and in terms of like who's benefiting and who's profiting. Insofar as I think one of the problems is that neoliberalization of our culture has resulted in us thinking of culture specifically in terms of ownership, strictly bounded by notions of privatization, right? We're so used to thinking it. So it's like oh well, that white guy can't go to that Japanese restaurant. That's part of my culture. I say this as Japanese, but I'm like, wait a minute. But who's to say that I have an ownership of like Japanese food per se, right? But then it becomes something altogether different when the white person is like profiting from it, right? It becomes something altogether when it becomes profitable, and then the Japanese person is not credited, right? So I think it's important for us to draw these distinctions, right? And also for us to not just be thinking about cultural appropriation in terms of its moralistic dimensions, but in terms of its political dimensions, right? So when I say that, I mean that it's important for us to think about cultural appropriation in terms of what it enables for us to move forward and to bring about advancement to get free, right? Like when we think about, like how does cultural appropriation help us achieve, the critique of cultural appropriation help us achieve black liberation, the ending of settler colonialism, etc., right? So I guess, anyway, that's kind of, so anyway, I guess what my answer to your question ultimately is, one, I think Said Professor Grundy is absolutely right about the, there is the academic language has enabled really good left critique, but it's also unfortunately been co-opted by kind of neoliberalization of critique as well. So misused by both, definitely misused by both.
I want to emphasize the point about history. So I work in the 18th century, I work in the 19th century, and it's true, cultural appropriation in this country has origins in settler colonialism, in genocide, in the removal of Native Americans and the extermination of them from the East Coast. And the first sort of writers of the early United States, I'm thinking James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, the only way that they could become internationally famous novelists and writers was to totally steal Native American culture and put that forward as a white American product, last of the Mohicans, right? Okay, that is like where American culture originated, in the 19th century. But it goes back even farther than that. I was talking to a friend who works on ancient Rome. So Rome conquered Greece and stole their gods. Okay, so cultural appropriation goes back that far, and it's about war and conquest and genocide, and being a conquering nation who exterminates a people and then steals their culture as a kind of totem of their success and power. So this is a really, really long history that in the New World Atlantic context takes on a specific modern racialized form that we've inherited completely, and that defines modern racism and the commodification of American culture. And so once you get out of this period of war, conquest, slavery, and removal, you get into this. That's all still happening, of course, but you add mass culture, commodification, and our modern media, and all of these cultural appropriations that I really think what Adrienne said about power relationships is really key in exploitation. All that has to be folded in. That has a long history of in war and conquest, basically, which I would want to emphasize when we're thinking about the present. Yeah. Do you want to?
A joke you might not funny. Sorry, a joke you might not find funny. So I just came here from somewhere else that was quite intense. A joke you might not find funny, I always tell students that there was an original word for cultural appropriation, and that word was culture.
Yeah.
The culture itself is a product of appropriation. Culture is always a messy process. It's a violent one, and arguably an inevitable one. I'd like to just say four things in answer directly to the question you posed. Why is it happening right now? You're mostly undergrads, right? Mostly undergrads. I think that the questions of cultural appropriation have become so hot right now amongst people of your generation, right? For a couple of reasons. I could be entirely wrong, but it won't matter because I'm on the stage. First and foremost, we have a new generation of students of color and students of immigrant backgrounds who are emerging within the American middle class and who are emerging in universities as they achieve the American middle class. And so there's an awareness now of who they are, what they are, and what this thing called culture means. Because at a certain age, usually in college age, you start asking questions of who you are, where you come from, what are you, right? And so questions of cultural appropriation become questions of what is your relationship to this thing called culture, but what is your relationship to these other people who are seeing you a certain way? Right? Now, this certainly has a history. Every generation goes through it, but it's happening right now for a number of reasons, and my colleagues here have nailed it historically. A couple other things, though. There's also a new visibility of minority cultural products out there, minority popular culture, and always historically, when you have these bursts of new kinds of minority cultural products in music and style and film and etc., particularly black cultural products, it always comes the debate about cultural ownership, right? Who is profiting? What are the meanings and the intentions? And who is this meant for, right? These conversations are products of the moment when multiple audiences and groups suddenly find themselves interacting over the same materials, right? And so that's important to understand. That's one of the reasons it's happening right now. Third reason, and someone mentioned it earlier, a couple of you mentioned it earlier, there's a kind of widespreading of the language of cultural criticism and anti-racial critique. You folks may not fully understand some of the details of race and gender and class and intersectionality, but you feel them. You feel them. You know something is going on. Something is not quite right. And so that sort of feeds this tension and concern around cultural appropriation, because in my opinion, most of the time we're not really talking about cultural appropriation. We're using cultural appropriation to find ways to talk about power and inequality and insecurity. And so cultural appropriation, culture becomes a way for us to talk about who can do what, who can't do what, where does it come from, etc. Sometimes I wish if we just sort of say, hey, let's just talk about power. Maybe we could understand things a little bit better, right? But I really wouldn't suggest that we take the conversation away from cultural products, because that brings us into the conversation about capitalism, marketing, media, and representation. And then it brings to the last thing I'm going to say for now, is that I think that there's a broader question in American culture right now about, well, what is culture? What does it actually mean? So cultural appropriation does feature people thinking they can define culture and often trying to defend culture and protect culture from X, from Y, from Z, right? And it's usually, we understand in terms of white racism and capitalism what the X, Y, and Z usually are, but I'm more interested in just that feeling that culture is something that can be either taken away or stolen or lost. All of that is predicated on the notion of what culture is. And I think that the question as to what is culture is a strong question, particularly when we, as a people, as a nation, are losing a sense of who we are. And we start grabbing on to culture. So those, I think, are reasons when I think about young people, your age and generally, engaging these conversations so passionately, I think it's because you're responding to this in the broader political climate.
Thank you for that response. Noting the themes of power and domination that came up, can you guys speak to the role of economics in conversations and issues of cultural appropriation?
No, I was, to, the point you just brought up about, um, you know, you said so many key things, and one of the things that reminded me of is part of, I think, what we're seeing in the groundswell of, this interest of amongst, a college cohort age of the subject is also consumption, right? Because you're talking about capitalism, and I think that 95% of the times I hear students talk about cultural appropriation, it's within the context of consumption, right? And so consumption, capitalist consumption and marketing has never moved at the speed that it has now. I mean, that's part of probably the biggest footprint of the digital revolution. Unfortunately, it was not an information revolution. It really was a consumption revolution. And it changed the way we consume and commodify everything. So the marketing itself is a product for which people become attached to the marketing, which then leads them to the actual commodity. You know what I'm saying? So what we actually sell is much more of a there's much more of a sort of a railroad tracking to the product, right? So you have to get your consumer in early to the whole process of being marketed, right? And you all are hyper consumers. You come from a generation of hyper consumers. Your parents are hyper consumers. And we are hyper consumers. This is our whole, post World War II, generation. We were trained to consume, and so I think that in that, capitalism is a fantastic amoeba of a creature, right? And its ability to say, oh, human rights. How can I sell that? Oh, Black Lives Matter. How could I sell that for Pepsi, right? Like that's what it does. I mean, that is the mastermind behind capitalism. Is like, how can I get AIDS to sell strollers to rich white ladies? Project Red, right? That's what it does. So I think that is part of the speed at which it moves and part of the interest. And to your point about these histories, and I'm so glad you brought it back to like James Fenimore Cooper and these early writers. And I say this because of this reason. Nell Irvin Painter's History of Whiteness, she engages a lot about Emerson, and she has this vitriol for our understanding of whiteness as a white supremacist project was equally about making whiteness intellectually superior as it was aesthetically superior. That the beauty of whiteness was as much a construct used against other peoples as the intellectualism of whiteness. All these things were promoted as the premier features of whiteness. And I think part of, the appropriation that I think is really particularly interesting for me is the ability to take the aesthetics of other people and still reaffirm white supremacy in those things, right? So you take Kim Kardashian, who has a body like half my friends, and you still reaffirm the beauty of white womanhood in her, right? Like, I think that sort of, it never actually, in this sort of vacuuming up of other spaces. It never actually changes the hegemony of what we.
No, and I would. That's a very good point. You'll never find a more sort of vehement defender of pure white-blooded heroism as James Fillmore Cooper, right? And so the Native Americans are an accessory to his vision of American history and American culture and a distinctive American national identity. So that it's a in that case an appropriation with distancing. It's not a celebration at all. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, just I just wanted to add to that. Something I was just doing before I came here was another conversation, and I had to remind people that the skinhead movement is rooted in an affection and appropriation of Jamaican immigrants in London. To be a true skinhead, you listen to ska, you listen to reggae, and you cut your hair the way Jamaican boys did in the 1960s. Of course, over time that turned into this hard right-wing racist movement, which is what we consider skinheads to be. But it's just interesting to pay attention to how something based on naked appropriation, right, can in fact transform over time into its vicious, vicious racist form, which is the Fenimore Cooper situation. People have this idea that affection is somehow distanced from racism. You can love the culture and hate the people.
Absolutely.
That's in fact part of why the tension around cultural appropriation is one for students, because you start to feel that, oh, it's my music you like, but not me. It's my experience you fetishize, but not equality. So these are part of the complexities of cultural appropriation. One thing I want to throw into the mix also is, on the other side, we know that horrible intentions can produce beautiful products, right? One of the first projects I worked on, first books, was about blackface minstrelsy, blackface, which has come up in a lot of these conversations about cultural appropriation. You know, frat parties with blackface, or the Mexican sombrero parties, etc. So there's a history of these kinds of appropriations, but the interesting thing is those appropriations then make possible black performers, right? Black performers became possible because they saw whites wearing blackface and then said, well, if we wear blackface, we can get up on stage too. And so now we have black popular culture largely based on blacks imitating whites imitating blacks. That's America. From the beginning.
Right.
Now we all got accept it. Don't run away from it. That's America, right? So the inequality, the violence, and the beauty, that weird stew is what we're all trying to figure out.
So kind of going off of what you guys were talking about, I know some of the definitions we talked about earlier about there's a essence of dominance within cultural appropriation, and specifically white dominance. And you were, Professor Grundy, you were talking about the Kardashians, like how they benefit off of like black bodies and black femininity. And so I just wanted to ask, based based off of that, based off of that, is the conversation really focused about who can appropriate culture instead of the actual appropriation of the culture itself? For instance, are white people more criticized for appropriating culture than another minority group in this case?
No, they just profit from it more.
I feel like I can have a more complete answer to this later, but I think the question of who can is sort of problematic in and of itself, and you know, because when we say who can, that also sort of implies some form of disciplinary structure and some form of punishment, right? So and again, I think that brings us back to the question of morality as opposed to politics, right? And I think and you know, to go back to again the sort of the definition of appropriation that Professor Keene is really really did a great job of framing, right? Is you know, a lot of our discussion is really one of taxonomy, right? Like, where are the boundaries of what we call appropriation versus what is culture, right? Because it's true, right? Like, all culture is hybrid, right? Like that's and transformative, right? Like there's no such thing as an originary singular pure culture ever. But we do have this phrase called cultural appropriation to describe like when it's effed up, right? Like like if we're getting really down to but I mean, but I remain agnostic on this in the sense that there are very clear instances of true exploitation, right? So so I think it's important for us to make those distinctions. But but in terms of like who can, right? Um, because I know y'all were, there's been all this conversation about Bruno Mars, right? Which, um, and I think one of the troubles with the Bruno Mars conversation is it seems to erase the legacy of Afro-Caribbean immigration, the history of hip hop, also the fact, whereas why aren't we necessarily talking about the music industry's appropriation of black art more generally, and like who's profiting, the white executives who are profiting from that, right? But in terms of like who can appropriate, yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, I'm kind of with Professor Grundy, right? Right, it's just like it's a question of who actually benefits, and like what forms of structural oppression get reified in the moment of what we call appropriation, right? That really should be the question, as opposed to who can or who can't do this, who can or who can't say that, right? Because so much of that occurs within social context. So much of that occurs within so much of it is case by case basis. So it's really important for us to always maintain a structural analysis of what's going on a case by case basis. And I'm not even going to necessarily preclude the possibility of white folks being able to do it ethically. It depends on a case by case basis.
Before we continue with this question, just to narrow the scope a little bit, we'd like you to speak more to the difference in backlash when white groups appropriate minority culture as opposed to minority groups appropriating other minority culture.
Can I just add one thing that you didn't mention? You mentioned two things: the difference between how when whites appropriate
Minority culture,
or when minorities appropriate
other minority
There's
culture.
a crucial thing you did not even mention, because it goes without saying that minority cultures appropriate whiteness all the time.
Yes.
But the fact that you didn't mention it is because that goes without saying.
Right.
It's just a sort of the norm.
It's
Exactly. But it's also crucial to speaking in the context of African American music and culture has always been about appropriating whiteness in different ways. I just wanted to point out that there's another thing in there that needs to be identified.
Yeah, and if we're thinking about the history of the term cultural, sorry.
Oh no, that's fine.
I mean, like Stuart Hall, right? Like Stuart Hall, when he was first articulating the ideas of cultural appropriation, he was referring to black folks taking on white art, right? So it is interesting thinking about the ways in which it has developed into again, it's a question of taxonomy.
Yes.
So I'm sorry.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Not about Stuart Hall, but the question of taxonomy. No, I think so. What the kind of two areas that this answer is touched on in terms of the like who can and what's the difference between, it's all these questions of the language that we use. And to me, I even like my body reacts when you say that people of color are appropriating whiteness, because that's not the way that I think about it. And that's, I think, the problem of the language that we use is that, because like ideally as an indigenous person I would like to be up here in traditional clothing and speaking my language and things like that, but white supremacy required that I assimilate to whiteness, and that so it wasn't those same levels of power that we keep getting back to. And then it's so interesting in all of the I mean, I've done hundreds of talks in the last 8 years on some facet of these conversations, and I always get the questions of like, who can? Is it the same if like someone from the black community wears a headdress as it is when like a white person does? Or the what is questions, like, well, is it cultural appropriation if I wear this thing, or is it if I wear this, or I just really want to know where the line is so I don't do this. And there's a writer named Ijoma Ulo, who has this amazing article on the establishment that talks about cultural appropriation being the wrong conversation in a lot of ways, that what we're really trying to talk about are these issues of power, and says that those questions of like who can, who can't, what is, what isn't, what the askers are really asking is, how do I continue to do what I'm doing without feeling bad about myself?
Yes.
And how do I continue to uphold white supremacy without feeling bad about myself? And that becomes the challenging part of these conversations, is that folks aren't really interested like some people are definitely interested in the larger conversations of power and settler colonialism and racial capitalism, but most people are just really like, I don't want to feel bad. I'm worried about someone coming up to me and accusing me of cultural appropriation and having an awkward conversation, so can you tell me how to not feel bad about myself? Which I don't think is the right conversation that we should be having.
Yeah, the who can and who can't thing always bothers me for another reason, because in the moment of articulating who can and who can't, you set yourself up as a cultural police officer, an arbiter as to what goes and what goes and cannot go, and you put yourself up as a representative of your people. You speak for your people, and I just loathe that always. It's just in me from when I was back when I was. This comes out of sort of being a musician too, where appropriation and exploit and playing with exploitation becomes very much a part of the language of artistic production. This always irks me, also coming from sort of being a black immigrant, right? Because even though they're absolutely right when we talk about power and capitalism and who is profiting and maintaining white supremacy, that's absolutely true. But I also take seriously what it's like being a person of multiple heritages, encountering, let's say, African Americans speaking of Africa in this romantic, glorified, essentialist way, and you come from Liberia, and you're like, well, or when you or you're West Indian and Jamaican, and suddenly everyone is like, yeah man, Rasta, smoking weed. But it's black people doing that to you, right? So yes, we've got these issues of power which we have to dislodge and explore, but at the same time, on an existential level, as a person of color, you do understand that there are people who stereotype you who also look like you, right? And I think that's a real thing that I think should be discussed, even though it may not work within the same, structure of conversations about power and capital.
So I have an interesting personal anecdote to that, and it's about traveling throughout the diaspora and how I could tell that what the U.S. was exporting in terms of black culture had shifted.
Yeah.
So when I was 16 and I was in Tangiers, I had very low, short, fade hair, a little taper fade as we call it in black culture, right? Very low hair. I maybe looked a little older than 16, and I remember walking around the markets in Morocco, and the little kids who all spoke like 5 and 6 languages, right? They would say, Black Sista, Black Power Sista, Black Power, Malcolm X Sista. Because they clearly recognized I was a black American, right? And Black Power, and that is what had been exported to the Arab world at that time. And then to revisit the continent a few years later, it was when gangster rap had blown up. And it was, what is up, homie? This is how Ghanaians were speaking to me. What is up, homie? And it was, and if I were to go now, it might be like, it might be Cardi B and Real Housewives. So what gets exported, we can always tell from these exchanges, right? Because to them, that was their moment of connection with, and I think black Americans throughout the diaspora, America as part of the global production of culture is really considered like an epicenter of exports, right? That we export movies, culture. We export entertainment. We are really the capital of that, right? We export way more than we import. And so the world there's a one-way mirror when you're American, that the world sees you, but you don't see the world. I mean, quite literally, the headlines of our magazines are not the same edition of that magazine for the rest of the world. I mean, quite literally, when Time Magazine in America will have, what is too old to breastfeed? And elsewhere in the world, it'll be like, an Asian woman who won the Nobel Prize. That's the cover of Time Magazine. This is like literally happened.
We're bombing something.
Yeah, right, exactly. Like the rest of the world will learn about like what's happening in Afghanistan, and our stuff will be like, what is too thin? Like, like that's the difference in being an American. And so there's a way in which we're seen, but we don't know who sees us until we're outside. And it was just a very fascinating exchange because as a black woman, the consequences of those cultural exports are very severe. So in one moment, I go from being Angela Davis to years later being assumed as Cardi B, or worse, to being assumed to be a prostitute. Depending on what point we are in our cultural exports, I might be a sex worker, right? And that is the very precipitous, very that is the constant state of vulnerability under which you live when a country where you have no power over your exports, right? You have no power over what is exported about your people, and then other people in your diaspora assume that's what you about.
And then, back to what I said earlier about the new generation of immigrant students, and you mentioned Ijoma Uluo. She and a lot of the contemporary African immigrant writers, they're writing about this. And so the question is to whether or not, and I know we've talked about this, Rachel, the Afro-Punk Festival has started to get criticized for African Americans appropriating African cultures. And so, exactly, it's becoming a thing. Now, a lot of people would like to dismiss it and say we're all one people, we're all one this, but I don't want to dismiss it because if people are feeling pain, there's something going on. And there's something that's worth exploring. I'm not going to say outside of the context of capital, because it's not outside of the context of capital. I'm just not sure how it's placed by capital, if it's not just another intra-ethnic rivalry being sort of generated by certain kinds of markets. It's certainly happening in publishing. And that's another story in terms of African American writers versus the new wave of African writers. But that's a long conversation going on. But the question as to whether or not African Americans can appropriate Africans is not a conversation being had in Africa.
Right.
It's not being had there. They're like, yo, sister black. That's a conversation being had here in America. So it goes back to being about different ethnic/immigrant groups trying to find their way, not only in America, but in an American conversation about race and identity that is profoundly broken. I think that's kind of what's going on.
I just want to make a minor observation about what I'm hearing, listening to you talk about all of your experiences, and then thinking about the histories we've been telling, is that cultural appropriation can't be seen in a strictly kind of mono-national context.
Yes.
It's always in the context of kind of transnational exchange, diaspora, a kind of global history of colonization and economics and commodification, and the kind of, we're in a totally global world of entertainment and media. So I think if you think of the culture as a thing that you own, that's unique to your place, well, it's always seen in relation to all of these sort of like huge geographical movements, especially now, but even going back to the period of New World exploration and colonization. So that's just an observation about what I'm hearing.
Expanding on your point, Professor Resnick, is cultural appropriation contingent on a concrete definition of culture? So in other words, how can culture be appropriated if there's no one definition of what culture is?
Well, just to point to the history of the term culture, so culture as a modern category, something that is inherent to a people or a nation, actually is co-emergent with the idea of nationalism as an ideology. So the idea that your principal affiliation in life is not with a religion or with a local community or with a region, but with a nation, a kind of like an imagined community. So that culture really arose in a way to kind of bolster that idea and that ideology, which is still so prevalent today. So I think when we think of cultures as being something profoundly intimate that we own in a national sense, I think that explains the kind of like intense reaction we have when we feel like it's being violated. It seems like an invasion of your national identity to have culture. So in terms of a coherent idea of culture, I mean, I think a lot of us have said, that idea is a contested idea. The idea of culture, what it is contested, but it's so intense because it has deep roots in a kind of national culture, in that sense.
19th century.
Yeah.
And I would add to that, so in sociology, every term in my race and ethnicity class, I start by teaching students not only the fallacy of race, but what's the difference between race and ethnicity. Yeah. And the piece on ethnicity, really, what makes it different from race is, in terms of what we have concluded in the social sciences, ethnicity has to be a shared idea of usness, right? It has to be that I feel I have a commonality with this group, and therefore our group is distinct from other people, right? There is no culture of one. A culture of one is impossible, and I think that's part of the fierceness of those boundaries is literally how we construct communities of ethnicity, which are not just racial. Ethnicities can be language, regional, geographic, hair types can become, formations of ethnicity. But it's because you have to believe that we are a group, we recognize ourselves as a group, and that is based on recognizing ourselves as distinct from another. Their mother, exactly.
Although, of course, I appreciate you bringing that up too, because obviously ethnicity can become racialized,
Yes.
and race can become
Ethnicized. Yes,
right?
absolutely.
I think
As our U.S. Census is now debating.
But what's also interesting, right, is like, I don't know. Let's take a look at all these like ridiculous alt-right white supremacist groups, right? These folks are like really re-ethnicizing themselves in a really
They want so
interesting way.
bad to be something.
Like they are identifying.
No, but that's it. That's it.
Yeah. No, you're right. Yeah.
General insecurity about who and what they are.
Yeah.
About unmarked whiteness
Yes.
is now causing white hysteria.
Yeah. No, that's
They
right.
want so badly to be marked.
Yeah, they want to be marked.
We have a census that is remarking white people as ethnic.
That's right. That's right.
After
That's right.
after 200
That's
years
right.
of benefiting from unmarked whiteness.
But yet
Yeah.
they also borrow from the language of minority discourse and black resistance to do so.
So, I mean, that's what's trippy, right? Is like Richard Spencer, for example, applauded when a group. There was this. I forgot which university it was, but this university that had a yoga class for disabled students. And they shut it down because they felt it was a form of cultural appropriation. Richard Spencer said, this is the kind of racial consciousness that we need. So Richard Spencer applauded this. It's also really disturbing, for example, that Steve Bannon reads a lot of intersectional feminist thought.
That is
right?
so disturbing.
This is this is a massive problem.
I've heard him quote Bell Hooks.
Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
Who is one of the main thinkers of cultural appropriation, right? So
But that's part of the craft of
the craft of white
perverting that.
supremacy.
Yeah.
Totally, yeah, and it's absolutely perversion.
Yeah.
There's no question about it, right? And very pro all these things still, but it is worth thinking about. The ways in which the structures of progressive cultural nationalism have enabled the repressive right ways in other particular ways.
Absolutely.
So it's now we have the perverse inversion of the Audre Lorde,
Like the servants'
the
tools.
servants'
when
tools
man
are
told
now
the
building the
servants'
master's house. It's horrible, right? That's what's happening now.
Right.
Anyway.
But that's your point about neoliberalism, though, right?
It is,
And
yeah.
and I think so another very important point of how these things operate in terms of the power dynamic. The power dynamic allows you to go through and actually pick which parts of those tools are going to serve your hegemonic construction, right? As we also pick which parts of people's cultures will serve, right? I mean, in the most basic form of cultural consumption, it allows you to say, okay, let's take Asian style and let's take black slang, and it allows you to pick from it what you want. And I think that's part of the perversion of it. I mean, the far right, sometimes I have to sit back and say, wow, they really, this dismissal that I think white liberals have of them is just ignorant. I'm like, I'm not buying it. There's an extremely calculated move to use our rhetoric against us, as they have done with the free speech campaigns.
Yeah.
They literally used
Yeah.
things that were used to protect marginalized people in their favor.
Yeah. I mean, and of course, this is a long-standing American tradition. 14th Amendment.
Yes,
Primary.
for corporate, 90% of case law of the 14th Amendment was for corporations. 90%.
I just want to go back though.
Sorry.
Dude, you know, they just said that we're academic nerding out. 14th Amendment, whoa. I want to say though, it's not just the alt-right. This actually has been happening in white racist activism for a long time.
Absolutely.
The notion that white ethnicity must be formed and protected
Yes.
in the way that black ethnicity is
Yes.
formed and protected, that goes all the way back.
Absolutely.
That's been happening for a very long time. If you can be black and have your, Black History Month, then we can be white and have a White History Month. And that's the fake equivalence that we were talking about earlier. But that's part of the difficulty with these conversations is in the academic and scholarly space, we see the contradictions, but we're talking in a public sphere where those contradictions are just all leveled out. Right? And that's the actual problem, I think.
Yes.
Right? It doesn't look like power, it looks like access.
And we have, and as higher ed, we have contributed greatly to that perversion.
Thank you for saying that. I agree.
We really have. I mean, not to name names, but there's a president of a private university in Boston. Pick one.
Pick another one.
Who seems to think that the far right, who are that white extremism outside of this university is more important than protecting black and brown people inside this university. That black scholars in this university state racist things, but racism is somehow
No. In the name of free speech and free expression.
right, exactly, right.
Or equal treatment.
Yeah, so I think that we actually, again, I mean, I think that one of the ways that we know that the power structure is the omnipresent force in all of this, right? Is because even when we attach these, marks of progress to them, they get corrupted against us, right? So yeah, the ability to protect underrepresented peoples in these spaces, we'll just co-opt that and say no, you need to hire men and women studies.
Well, that actually brings us back to the immediate context for this audience, because the conversation about cultural appropriation as it emerges amongst undergraduates in colleges, not only there, but that's a very prime space for it, hence this event, is because I think people are feeling that power is being manipulated and misused, and people do feel threatened. And I think that the conversation about cultural appropriation, even though at times I can be quite dismissive in some cases, it does express the language of anxiety and fear. And it's a language of anxiety and fear that we know is rooted in material violence. And we know it is, not only historically,
Absolutely.
but in Austin, Texas. Right?
Yes,
We know it's
absolutely.
happening. And so that's why it becomes a way to talk about it, but it's that fear.
And can we go back to this? I'm going to let you speak. But can we go back to this the conversation about culture itself? In sociology, of course, we have a whole school of thought around culturalism and cultural explanations for dynamics. And of course, that catches a lot of slack from the structuralists who, argue that, these
Production.
things are all, matters of structural inequalities, etc. Of course, it's never all one thing and all the other. And, what I teach my students all the time is that, yes, a lot of the culturalist arguments have gotten it wrong because they have been racist arguments. But we know that culture does inform the way people think, act, react, etc., right? And part of this is what I'm interested in, is in what and who we are naming as culture, right? So, like the culturalist thing, yes. Is it racist if you use a cultural frame against poor black people in the South Side of Chicago and say they have a culture of violence? Absolutely. But here's my thing with that. If you're going to do that, then let's be equal opportunity and say there's a culture of drug consumption amongst white people.
and serial killing.
And there's a culture of mass shooting
Cultural serial.
amongst young white men. Like, let's
That
call it
racist?
what it is.
That racist?
Let's call it what it is. It's like, I want to understand all the fatherless, broken homes, apparently, that mass shooters
Mass
come out.
shooters,
Because these
yeah.
people just don't raise their children like we do.
Oh,
You know,
absolutely.
like that's that. If you're gonna use these cultural tropes, let's use the cultural tropes,
Across
right?
the board, yeah.
Across the board, like let's be real. Let's be real equal opportunity about using culturalist tropes, right?
Absolutely.
Let's talk about why your white women are strung out on Prozac and everything else. Like, is that a culture of white femininity in the suburbs? Because you would use that for women who look like me. You know,
No, absolutely.
why y'all cuss your mamas out? Is that a cultural thing? I want to know. You know, like that's what I'm talking about. Like if you're going to name culture, then you have to name cultures. You cannot segment off the population and say they're directed by their culture and somehow our culture is
Absolutely.
unmarked.
Say that
That's-
you've killed all the chill on this. There is zero chill remaining here. There's zero chill.
But what you've done is just help us put the question of, I mean, appropriation is a political and
Yes.
economic dynamics. Now we're at the question of this thing called culture and how it gets deployed and redeployed and misdefined and redefined and lines drawn around it, but they're not equally applied. Absolutely. It's a problem and an issue. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you for that very lively conversation. We're gonna open up questions to the audience. If
There's an
anybody has
audience here?
something
Sorry. Hey, what's up?
There's a microphone coming around. Deirdre, we have somebody in the front. Thank you. I will help you out.
All right. Hey, everyone. Thank you, panelists. You guys are super entertaining and awesome. I have two questions, actually, and you can decide how or when you'll answer either of them. But the first one is about Professor Rivera. You mentioned instances of white people in particular culturally appropriating to the end of revolutionizing. And I wonder, or something, if I'm not misquoting you, but something to that effect, that there are somewhat positive potentials or consequences with white people exploiting or extracting culture of non-dominant groups. So like, if you could talk more, kind of tease that out, like what are instances in which that could occur?
I don't know. I mean, I said that in order to say that I do not preclude its impossibility. But I didn't necessarily have a specific example in mind because most examples are pretty terrible, right? I'm just saying that like I'm leaving it open for the possibility of I guess of a kind of a 1%, I suppose. I mean, let me think here. I suppose it's all right, let me ask this: was John Brown appropriating the Black liberation struggle?
Yes, right.
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 It's like that's not your struggle, John Brown. You know what I mean? Like I guess the thing is like if we
Right.
completely remove
Yeah.
the possibility of
Right.
of white appropriation being like
Yeah.
impossible to be liberatory, then I think allyship then becomes also possibly impossible as well. I don't know, but honestly, like but you got to work for it. Right? Like the standards have to be considerably
You have to
high.
John Brown it out. Like,
Yeah.
you have
You know
to
what
go
I mean?
full John Brown.
That's a high bar. That's a high bar. Gotta burn some shit down.
Gotta be on the dot board, apparently.
And then the last question is about the power dynamics within appropriation as it occurs among people of color. And can we kind of tease out the instances within which that occurs? Professor chude-sokei, you mentioned being a West Indian immigrant and kind of like, and also probably an African immigrant and African Americans and dealing with that. And so can we talk about instances in which that actually occurs and where and who and how do Black people or African Americans in particular have power over perhaps more marginal ethnic groups or vice versa?
Let me first, the question that you'd asked Takeo, I'm not happy that Takeo struggled to find one. Because I could list lots of white performers, culturally, literary, musically, personally, that I really think did and do and have done great, 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 great work. But I also know that not being a cultural gatekeeper, I could say this person produced great music that inspired me and other people, but then there are other black people who say, well, there's still a cultural appropriation going on and I'm comfortable with it, etc. Which only reminds us that there is no one static black group who's responding to cultural appropriation in one specific way, right? There are people who will look at, I mean, we look at Marvin Gaye and you talk to Marvin Gaye and Marvin Gaye would say, well, Frank Sinatra. Right? You know, they're all in all kinds of influences. Yes, the power dynamics are different, but there are whites who have done enormous work on so many different levels. I don't want to make it seem like it's not possible or it doesn't happen. It's just that we will all debate and differ as to the level with which they were given a pass, as it were. So I just wanted to say that. The second thing, though, the question of power, the question of power when it comes to that's why I'm interested in how people actually effectively respond to this question of cultural appropriation. Because sometimes power is how you feel, not where you occupy the actual structure. For example, a lot of African immigrants and West Indian immigrants, despite having privilege, are immigrants. And so they feel severely disempowered culturally, linguistically, socially, and then they encounter African Americans who may be socioeconomically disempowered but seem culturally quite powerful and influential. And if you come from countries, like you talked about going there are places in the world, black people would be shocked to find out that they're oppressed in America. Yeah. Because they encounter African American popular culture and they're like, right? I remember when I went back to Nigeria after Colin Powell had become the Secretary of State. In Nigeria, there were people celebrating because they figured he's the leader of the army, he's going to lead a coup, and he's going to be the president. I'm not making that up. I'm not making that up because that was their logic, right? And black people are that close to power. And African Americans have always represented in the black diaspora power. They may not have experienced power, they may have been lynched and marginalized and abused and exploited, but the public representation that America made of blacks through music and pop culture is an empowered race of people, and that's what a lot of immigrants got before they came here. So that's why I want to disentangle actual power from effective power, and because that convolutes the relationship. So does that answer the question?
I mean, I can speak to a specific example.
Yes, please.
So I think this, like I said before, this question of like intergroup kind of appropriation is something that comes up all the time online and both in talks that I do. And so one example that I think kind of highlights the deep complexities of this was a few years ago. Pharrell, the singer, was on the cover of Elle France wearing a headdress. And so it was this moment of this black performer wearing a sacred headdress from indigenous communities. And so Native folks rightfully felt hurt by that. That's a piece that has to be earned by the wearer. It's something that's really sacred. But then as a moderator of my Facebook page, I began to see an unprecedented level of anti-blackness that emerged from indigenous folks in trying to express their anger over Pharrell wearing the headdress. And so to me, the anger was directed at the photo director who chose that headdress to put on Pharrell for the cover. It wasn't at at himself, because the decisions that performers have in those spaces are very limited.
True.
But on my Facebook page, there were Native folks using the N-word, like multiple times, to be like, well, how would you like it if I called you this? And or how would you like it if? So to me, it showed, like, even if that in that situation we're saying like, oh, Pharrell might be in a position of power over indigenous folks, but then there's this deep anti-blackness that comes out in indigenous communities that has a long history behind it, that has deep roots as well. So there's no easy way to talk about those positionings of power in that dynamic, which is why it becomes hard when our definition of cultural appropriation hinges on these issues of power. So it's something that I have always, and just like with conversations of racism and the ways that we talk about that, I feel like it's very similar to conversations of cultural appropriation, that the anti-blackness, the anti-indigeneity can occur laterally, but it doesn't exist in the same system of power that we're talking about from the dominant group to marginalized populations.
Add another wrench in that in terms of, we're talking, I'm assuming we're talking about, these lateral appropriations, but
Yeah.
can we also talk about sort of the vertical appropriation of, for example, the appropriation of, black straight people, of black queer culture, right? Like, like that adds, for me, another wrench. I mean, I always have this half joke in which culture starts with black and Latinx queer people, then it moves to black women, and then by the time it gets to white queer men, it's over. Like, it's done. All right? Because then it's like, stop saying slay. Like, that's my theory of it. But in that, it's like, I've had I've been around many expression of queer people. Like, I cringe when I hear straight people say slay, right? And yet Beyonce's made an empire out of. I mean, Paris is Burning, Madonna made an empire out of voguing, and that was a white woman. But it's like, what happens when vertically inside a group you can do the same thing? It's like, like to your point, if people are feeling pain, it's worth discussing. All right.
But again, though, even you critiquing culture, or we're using the category to describe these processes, and it's because we're using culture and cultural phenomena to have these other conversations.
Yes.
And I
Yes,
think what
about
we're trying,
like- yeah,
I think
right.
what we want to do is have those other conversations, but the only language we really seem to have
Yeah.
are these loaded languages, loaded with culturalist assumptions, loaded with neoliberal assumptions that culture can be owned, and loaded with notions of cultural ownership, right? Because one thing I'm very interested in is, how do these things called cultures actually change? And where do we see change happening? And doesn't change always imply or involve the other? Right? It's a tricky place to be, right? So I'm trying to find ways of thinking about that in a progressive and positive way, right? And I also think about, someone like Bob Marley, who great leader of black, cultural resistance. Bob Marley grew up being called a cultural appropriator because he's
Right.
half white.
Right.
And when Bob Marley became Bob Marley, he was accused of overcompensating for his half-whiteness by being extra black. No, this was exactly how
Right.
he was treated. So even a lot of these figures that we consider
Right.
authentic and fully authoritative voices of their
Right.
culture come from quite complicated.
We haven't even talked about authenticity.
Well, that's
we
another.
haven't even talked about.
That's next week, same time.
But yeah, but it's true though. I mean,
Yeah.
authenticity is actually at the core of understanding what cultural appropriation is sort of
That's
about.
funny. Well, that's what authenticity means core.
Right.
Exactly.
It's essential.
Essential.
Do it.
Okay, nerding out again. Sorry, move on. The question? Hopefully this shows you the joys of graduate school, so you can go to grad school.
This too can be your life.
This is, you too can have this fun.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, not to get too off track, but about activism.
So where's the person?
Right here.
Oh, sorry.
So the question is kind of how important experiential overlap is. And I'm kind of going to bring up an example of Booker T. Washington, who is kind of like an ivory tower philosopher, saying that everyone should kind of like lay down their arms and just kind of, just be submissive so you can move for change. But I think that, in today's world where we have Ben Carson over urban housing and development, that's not really a position that's great for him. And I don't think that that's a position where he can actually call himself an activist. So how important is experiential overlap in activism and being an ally?
So that goes back to the John Brown question, I think, right? John Brown was never enslaved, right? But John Brown did more to, he was more of a catalyst for abolition than any other white person in his time, probably, right? I think hands down. So I think the activism, I don't have to go to prison to be an activist for incarcerated people, right? I don't think the experiential part
Oh, that's what you mean.
is that required as a prerequisite. To the point of activism, though, and consumption, etc., I have a term I call social justice climbers. And you all as student groups need to stop employing these people, right? They, activist, all right, in his blue vest. You need to stop employing people who have made a cottage industry out of black politics, all right? Stop bringing them to your campuses. There's nothing they add that you don't know. There's absolutely nothing they add. Stop being impressed by eye rolls on CNN. That's black female minstrelsy. Like, they brought her on there because they wanted to get the same audience that was watching VH1, right? They wanted to get a target demographic, and so they brought someone who's one punditry shy of throwing a drink in someone's face. Stop being impressed by this, right? That's social justice climbing. They post more of their outfits than they have ever met with local organizers. Don't fall for it. Elevate your taste.
Is that your term, social justice class?
You can have it.
No, I'm gonna quote you. I'm gonna appropriate it. And that's an amazing term. I'm gonna use it. I'm gonna credit you, but it brings back the question that you deliberately brought up of leadership. You said activism, but you meant leadership. That's why you brought up Carson.
Right.
Throwing Carson that you just did that as a joke, right?
Right.
I don't think anybody buys that he's an activist.
No.
He's not
He
even a
would
bad
never
activist. He just doesn't,
Right.
So, but we're talking about activism and its relationship to experience, right? What she's reminding us is that there are people who occupy the space of activists who are not activists. And the more a movement grows and becomes significant, the more you have these social justice climbers appropriating and getting involved in it. So that's totally legit, right? But I do want to defend Booker T, though.
Yes.
I think historically it's not actually.
He's been over essentialized.
Yeah, you want to clarify that?
I didn't want to simplify that too much. I just wanted to say that people who might have an economic advantage may be less sensitive to issues, or not even less sensitive, but have a different approach because of their upbringing.
Absolutely, but it's also the case, as C.L.R. James, great revolutionary, once said, and I'm going to paraphrase, he said that historically, some of the people who really cut forth a lot of the more radical movements are people who have been privileged enough to see what the system has to offer and to acknowledge its limits for their own people, right? So that's historically true. That's historically true. The reason I wanted Booker T. Washington to sort of return to this conversation is there are those who would say that it may seem like submissiveness, but he was actually quite radical in quite unique ways, supporting a lot of movements, acknowledging that at a time when blacks are being killed for sport, you have this very important black person talking to the president, knowing that he can't, act like X, Y, and Z on CNN now. He can't act like that, but he has to find a way to represent and and push forward black advancement through industrial education, etc. So that's something but I just wanted to say to those who may not.
And I think the other thing, I keep returning to this question of privatization, right? Because I think so much of us are limited when it comes to revolutionary imagination. So many of us are so used to thinking of individuals as opposed to actions, right? Like the question of whether or not I should call myself a feminist. Like, that's an unimportant question. That's an unimportant question. The question is whether your actions are doing this or that, right? And so the question of activism, right? So much of it is hinged upon, well, do I have the legitimacy according to my identity?
Exactly.
Right? So much of that, right? And I'm going to go back to Angela Davis again. Angela Davis said in some article that she wrote that it is her politics that define her identity, not her identity that defines her politics.
Exactly.
Right? That's key. That is so key. So I think it's important for us to not be so wedded to. Now that said, I do want to validate what you're saying in terms of you're in a seminar and there's some privileged ass person is saying this or that, and it's clear that they're coming from a particular place. So there is a micropolitics that exists, right? And these microaggressions, these things are real, but that should never preclude possibilities.
And the beauty of the notion of intersectionality, that is a term that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, is that intersectionality comes with a kind of moral and political imperative to build new communities. And in terms of activism and identity, intersectionality reminds us that we are already parts of multiple communities and multiple systems of power that we have to undo all simultaneously. So in terms of activism right now and identity, for me it's really about building new communities, new alignments, and new cultures, right?
And I, Takeo, you said something very important, in bringing up that Angela Davis quote, and as well as, the whole context of what you were saying. I really want to employ young people to be self-aware and self-examining about the ways you consume activism as culture, and let me even more specifically than that, right? There's an apocryphal story that the person who told it to me swore on their grandmother's life that it was true, in which at Nike Corporation, this is a funny story. Nike Corporation dealing with two of the biggest black athletes of their day, Michael Jordan and Tiger Woods. The black woman in charge of doing all this sort of marketing campaign for them, she says, Michael Jordan came in, got his check, wanted to know, about the X's and O's on the contract, wasn't really about nothing in terms of any sort of like changing the face of anything, got his check and bounced. Tiger Woods comes through and says, I want to make sure everybody on this campaign is black behind the camera. I want to make sure that this is serving these and these. And who are your scientists on the shoe? So the people who are performing a certain type of authenticity, that is not necessarily aligned to the actions, right? Like
Booker
the
T.
actual, yeah, like we encapsulate Booker T as like, oh yeah, well, that was the house Negro, but it's like, think more complicated about these things. If you are just going to consume the performance of people's politics and not actually interrogate their actual politics and actions, then you are the cultural you have just consumed a damn revolution like it was a can of Coke.
And that's the thing about identity too. With identity, you really never know where people are coming from. You really never know.
That's what I
know.
find, and I think maybe we have all lived long enough that we find identity to be not a promise of much.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah.
Not in our engagements in this institution and our field, our profession, identity is not a promise of much that lies beyond that surface.
That's
right?
Absolutely.
I have found some of the staunchest white supremacists to share my Fenty number of foundation.
What?
That's a makeup line.
Yeah.
Oh.
Like that. It is not very indicative of the politics beyond the frame.
You can't tell. You can't tell.
Hi, so I had a question on, I love these conversations about cultural appropriation and trying to understand what culture is, and I feel like these are conversations that I only really hear now in my lifetime, and I wish that I had heard about these things while I was in school instead of learning about other stuff that I'm not using right now. And so how do you try to explain this to kids in the school system? Because it seems to me, at least in my experience, that it's more focused on between individual families. So, the parents take it on, okay, we're going to expose you to these different cultures. You have to understand that you are not the only person in the world, versus in school where it's like, well, America's great, this is us, and that's it. So how do you try to explain this to kids so that they have more time and a better understanding of culture and cultural appropriation?
Right, there you go.
Oh, thanks. So I don't know if I have the perfect answer, but I teach an Indigenous education course right now, and we are often thinking about the role of Indigenous knowledges in both schools that are centered for Indigenous students in Indigenous communities, but also the role of Indigenous knowledges in mainstream public schooling. And so thinking these conversations come up all the time of, I teach a lot of pre-service teachers in my course, of how do I explain this to second graders, or like, what's the conversation, how do I talk about genocide with 5-year-olds or whatever it is. And I think what the scholarship around indigenous knowledges and indigenous education, and even there's a brilliant curriculum in the state of Washington called Since Time Immemorial that focuses on a lot of these things. And Since Time Immemorial has a lesson for second graders around sacred sites that asks for them to draw a place that is incredibly important and powerful and meaningful for them, and then has the teacher go in the room and rip one of them up to like demonstrate what it feels like for indigenous peoples to go through the loss of this, like. And so I mean, I think that we don't, it's kind of intense. There's two levels of the lesson. One is like the surprise, and one is to have a student who's in on it, and then you rip up their paper. But that's a side note. But I think the broader conversation around is that we often don't give children credit for being able to handle these conversations, for being able to think deeply and critically about the world around them, and there's hope that these conversations can be brought in schools, but the reality is that a lot of it does happen at home. It does happen outside. It happens within communities. But I think your question just made me think about these conversations that are happening around indigenous knowledges, bringing them into schools and using that as a foundation for thinking about settler colonialism and the way that these knowledges are being taken away actively every single day from that context. So that was a little bit roundabout, but I think the question is a good one of how do we start to challenge the hegemonic discourses that are in the classrooms now.
I want to turn that question to our token white person.
It's great to be the only white person on a panel. This has happened to me multiple times. It's actually a real honor.
Because it's quite different for someone like myself to be teaching,
Right.
and Saida, or for you to be teaching, or Takeo. I think there's also a particular political concern and burden there for you, and I'd like to hear how you respond to that.
To teaching second graders? I don't teach second graders.
Just the same thing.
Yeah, so I guess when I taught a class in African American Studies last semester on these early black writers, from Phyllis Wheatley to David Walker, like up to 1830, really early people who are my heroes, who I write about. I don't bring an experience of racism to my scholarship. I don't experience racism as a white person in this country. But it's my duty to understand racism and to understand its origins and its legacy and how it shapes our culture today. And I do that through reading literature by black writers, by enslaved writers, through collaborating with and talking to scholars of color who work on the same material, and through citing them and being politically engaged in the modern world, which is, I think, is a basic responsibility of anybody. And I think when I teach in the classroom, when I teach this stuff, I bring scholars of color into the classroom with me. I had 2 colleagues come talk to my classroom, and I listened to my students. The first time in my career I taught a majority people of color class, which is African American Studies class last semester, and I just listened to my students. I don't know if this is exactly what you were looking for, but it's a real privilege to be able to talk about these issues with my colleagues and with students of color, and to really fight for the visibility of these issues on the university campus, basically.
I ask because it's so crucial that you all understand that this isn't something that black people are working on, or Native Americans are working on, or indigenous people are working on, or immigrants is working. This is the legacy of the United States.
Yeah, and race as a modern fiction, as a concept, racism as like the major reality that defines our culture, is the duty of everyone to understand. It's corrupted American culture in every direction from the very beginning, and it's a duty for everyone to understand that.
Thank you. So we are out of time, but we will do one more question.
You're
not affected by racism, and I want to say, how do you respond to the question about why we white people don't claim their race?
Well,
And so, because I'm
yeah.
really curious about that.
I mean, by saying I'm definitely affected by racism. I don't experience racialized subjection because of my inhabiting of a white identity. But
Yeah, I understand what
yeah.
you meant, but I think it's really important to sort of claim race
yeah.
and to claim you being part of the dynamic of racism.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's obviously super central to acknowledge one's racial position in the country. It's I think what we were saying before. White people get to their race, their identity gets to be read as pure negativity, as not existing, as kind of the default. As you know, that is it's purely ideological. It's purely ideological, and I think that a lot of white people, don't acknowledge their racial position. Is totally true, and I think it's very damaging, and it's really important to point it out to white people all the time that they have a racialized position in this culture, in the world, wherever they go. When they apply for a job or they enter a restaurant or anything, they go into Starbucks and use the bathroom without any questions. Like that is a racialized position that it's the duty of every white person to acknowledge and to fight to change.
I guess I objected to your simplifying your role as an actor and your agency in systemic racism. And I think it's really important for white people to really think about presenting it in a much more complex way.
Yes,
and that's
no, I
all
agree.
that I'm sort of challenging.
Okay, yeah, no, I agree with that. It's very complicated. It's not simple at all. No, I agree with that. Yeah.
Do we have any final questions before we close this event? Oh, sure. This will be our last question because I know we are past time.
She's been coerced.
Hello. I was just going to ask, because I think Professor Grundy, you kind of alluded to it. What are your thoughts on the sort of co-opting of, black women's features by, mainstream media as, attractive without acknowledging that it is, stereotypically associated with black women? Big lips, big butt, it's praised when it's on white women, but, it's denigrated when it's seen on dark-skinned women of color, particularly black women.
I mean, like I said, that goes back to that very long history in American literature has been front and at the front of creating white aesthetic supremacy, right? The great irony of that is that white feminine beauty was promoted as virtuous and as chaste, right, as worthy of protecting, as worthy itself, and then lust and sex and desire were mapped onto indigenous women and to women of African descent. And so I think in that, whenever you have white women trying to stay in the element of virtue and chaste, but also co-opt the elements of lust and desire, they will go after who were the targets of white men's, rape, lust, consumption. I mean, literally, our country is based on the consumption of black women's wombs. That's what fueled slavery, right? That is what created our slave population. We kidnapped people, and then we created them through sexual exploitation. So I think that, but, to our point about this appropriation, black women, the requirements that black and indigenous women and Latinx women have had to conform our bodies to whiteness. I mean, every time I go to the post office, I have a conversation with some sister behind the counter about how her uniform, is like, I feel her in this drag of this is not made for my black body, right? These little postal office slacks are not made for my black body, right? And I think so, but we pay a very high price for having the very bodies that white women associate with lust, etc. And I'm not just flabbergasted, but I'm highly offended is too easy. highly insulted by the ability of a white aesthetic commodification to literally make famous white women who are famous for no other reason, for no other reason than having sex with black men and being built like black women. Like, really?
You remind me of Greg Tate. They asked him, what did white America take from black people? And he said, everything but the burden.
Everything but the burden.
All right, guys. Thank you
Tate.
so much for this panel and for attending this event.
Hey, thank Rachel and Donavon for putting it together, please.